When a young gas station attendant scribbled a message on Clint Eastwood's receipt, he knew he had to act fast. Blood. That was her first thought as she stared at the canvas, not because there was any, the painting remained pristine white, but because she knew there should have been. The gallery's security lights cast harsh shadows across the empty frame where her masterpiece had hung just hours before. Ellie Whittaker stood frozen, her phone still clutched in her hand, the gallery owner's frantic call replaying in her mind. 20 years of work culminating in her first solo exhibition, and now the centerpiece was gone. But it wasn't just a painting that was missing, it was the only evidence that could either condemn or exonerate her. Ms. Whittaker, Detective Clint Eastwood's voice cut through her thoughts. Tall with a weathered face and eyes that missed nothing, he studied her with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd seen too many people on their worst days. When was the last time you saw the painting? Last night, after the opening. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. Around 11. And you're certain it was still here then? She nodded, remembering how she'd lingered in front of it after everyone had left, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake putting it on display. If the truth it contained would finally set her free or destroy everything she'd built. This wasn't just a theft, she said, meeting Eastwood's gaze. Whoever took it knows what it means. And what does it mean, Ms. Whittaker? There was something in his tone, not quite accusation, but a careful probing. Before she could answer, the gallery door opened and a familiar figure stepped inside. Time seemed to stop as Hank Whittaker crossed the polished floor, his expensive shoes echoing in the silence. Even at 60, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to owning any room he entered. His face, once the subject of her most intimate sketches, now filled her with a cold dread. I came as soon as I heard, he said, voice all concern, but his eyes, when they met hers, held something else entirely, a warning. This must be devastating for you, Ellie. Detective Eastwood watched the exchange with interest. Mr. Whittaker, I understand you were Ms. Whittaker's guardian years ago. And proudly so, Hank smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Ellie has become one of the most important artists of her generation. Ellie felt her chest tighten as his gaze shifted to the empty frame. They both knew what had hung there. Blood Memory, she'd called it. A painting 20 years in the making, layers upon layers of meaning, visible only to those who knew where to look. And what lay beneath the surface, what she'd hidden in plain sight, would destroy the carefully constructed narrative of Hank Whittaker's life. The gallery's security footage was disabled at exactly 2:17 a.m., Detective Eastwood continued. Very professional job. No fingerprints, no evidence left behind. How unfortunate, Hank said, placing a hand on Ellie's shoulder that felt like lead. But I'm sure with your expertise, Detective, you'll find who's responsible. As his fingers pressed into her skin, Ellie knew with absolute certainty that he was behind the theft. The question now was whether he'd simply taken the painting, or if it was already ash, the truth it contained burned away forever. Actually, she said, stepping away from Hank's touch, there's something you should know about the painting. She looked directly at Detective Eastwood, ignoring Hank's sharp intake of breath. It contains evidence of a crime committed 20 years ago. Hank's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. Ellie, he said softly, think very carefully about what you're about to say. The detective's gaze shifted between them. What kind of crime, Ms. Whittaker? Ellie took a deep breath. There was no going back now. Murder. 20 years earlier. The first time Ellie met Hank Whittaker, she was 19 and desperately trying not to appear intimidated. As the owner of the largest art gallery in Arizona, Whittaker had his pick of young artists to mentor. When he chose Ellie, quiet, intense Ellie with her sketchbooks full of shadows, whispers followed her through the small desert town. He only picked you because you're pretty, her friend Lex said, not unkindly. With her vibrant blue hair and multiple piercings, Lex was everything Ellie wasn't. Bold, outspoken, unafraid to take up space in the world. He picked me because I'm good, Ellie replied, though doubt crept in around the edges of her certainty. She'd seen how Whitaker looked at her during their first meeting, his gaze lingering a beat too long. Hank Whitaker's studio was a converted gas station at the edge of town, all high ceilings and natural light. On her first day, he set her to organizing his supplies, watching as she carefully catalogued his expensive paints and brushes. "You have remarkable hands," he said, taking her wrist to examine her fingers. "Strong but delicate. The hands of someone who understands that creation and destruction are two sides of the same coin." By the end of the first month, Ellie was spending every free moment at the studio. Whitaker was a demanding mentor, but generous with his knowledge, teaching her techniques that weren't in any curriculum. He encouraged her to explore the darker themes that had always fascinated her: grief, trauma, the shadowed corners of human experience. "You have a rare gift," he told her one evening as they worked late. "You see beneath the surface to the truth of things." Lex didn't approve. "He's isolating you," she warned. "When's the last time you hung out with anyone else?" "You don't understand," Ellie insisted. "This is the opportunity of a lifetime." The night everything changed began like any other. Whitaker had been working on a new series, massive canvases exploring what he called the architecture of violence. Ellie stayed late, helping him prepare for an upcoming exhibition. They'd been drinking wine, something that had become a ritual, when he asked her to pose for him. "Just some reference sketches," he said, arranging her on the small couch in the corner of the studio. "I want to capture that quality you have, vulnerability with an undercurrent of steel." Something about the way he positioned her made Ellie uncomfortable, but the wine had dulled her instincts. When he touched her shoulder to adjust her pose, his hand lingered, then slid down her arm. "Hank, don't you trust me, Ellie?" His voice was soft but insistent. "After everything I've taught you?" What happened next remained fragmented in her memory, his weight pressing her down, her voice frozen in her throat, the cold realization that no one knew she was there. Afterward, as she pulled her clothes back on with shaking hands, Whitaker acted as if nothing unusual had occurred. "You should go now," he said, already turning back to his work. "Early start tomorrow, right?" She stumbled back to her small apartment, collapsing into Lex's arms the moment her friend opened the door. "We need to report him," Lex insisted, fierce in her protectiveness. "He can't get away with this." But Ellie knew the reality. Whitaker was a celebrated artist with powerful connections. She was a young nobody with no proof and too much alcohol in her system. "No one will believe me," she whispered. 2 days later, unable to eat or sleep, Ellie made a decision. She would confront Whitaker, demand an apology, some acknowledgement of what he'd done. When she arrived at the studio, however, she found Lex already there. "Can't just prey on your students," Lex was saying, her voice rising in anger. "Ellie, trusted you." Whitaker's face was a mask of cold fury. "You have no idea what you're talking about. I suggest you leave before you say something you'll regret." "I'm going to report you," Lex shot back. "Not just to the gallery, to the police." What happened next played out with horrifying clarity. Whitaker grabbed a heavy bronze sculpture from his desk, one of his own creations, ironically titled Justice, and swung it at Lex's head. The sound it made was sickening, wet and hollow at the same time. Lex crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath her blue hair. Ellie must have made a sound because Whitaker whirled around, his eyes wild with panic when he saw her in the doorway. "Ellie," he said, dropping the sculpture. I didn't mean..." She turned and ran, her mind unable to process what she'd just witnessed. Behind her, she heard Whitaker calling her name, his footsteps following. She ran until her lungs burned, finally ducking into the town library and hiding among the stacks. When she finally emerged hours later, shaking and disoriented, she learned that Lex had been found dead, the victim of what appeared to be a random break-in gone wrong. The town was in shock, security was heightened, and Hank Whitaker expressed his profound grief at the tragic loss of such a promising young artist. No one connected him to the crime. No one except Ellie, who had no proof beyond her own traumatized memory. 3 days after the funeral, Whitaker found her alone in the local diner. "I know what you saw," he said quietly, sliding into the booth across from her. "And I know you haven't told anyone." Ellie couldn't speak, her throat closing with fear. "I want you to understand something," he continued, his voice gentle as if soothing a frightened animal. "If you ever speak about what happened, no one will believe you. They'll say you're obsessed with me, that you fabricated the story out of jealousy or mental instability." He leaned closer. "But more importantly, I want you to consider what you'd be throwing away. Your talent is extraordinary, Ellie. I can make sure you have opportunities most artists only dream of." "You killed her," Ellie whispered. "It was an accident," he replied, expression unreadable. "A terrible, regrettable accident that can never be undone. The question now is whether 2 lives should be destroyed instead of just 1. The next day, Ellie left town. She told no one where she was going, changed her phone number and disappeared. But she didn't stop painting. Instead, she channeled her trauma and guilt into her work, creating pieces that spoke to the shadows of human experience without ever directly revealing their source. And throughout it all, she worked on a single canvas that she kept covered whenever anyone else was present, layering paint and memory, creating a visual testimony that only those who knew where to look would understand. In it, she encoded the truth, the exact shape of the sculpture, the angle of the blow, the distinctive pattern of blood spatter on Whitaker's shoes. For 20 years, she carried the weight of her silence, watching from afar as Whitaker's reputation continued to grow, until finally she was ready to let the painting speak for her. "You can't possibly believe this," Hank laughed, though his eyes remained cold. "Ellie has always had a flair for the dramatic in her art, Detective. It's what makes her work so compelling." Detective Eastwood's expression gave nothing away. "These are serious allegations, Ms. Whitaker. You're claiming Mr. Whitaker murdered someone 20 years ago, and your evidence was this stolen painting?" "Her name was Alexis Wright. Everyone called her Lex," Ellie said, her voice growing stronger. "She was my best friend. The official report said she was killed during a break-in at Whitaker's studio, but I was there. I saw him do it." "And you waited 20 years to come forward?" Eastwood asked, not accusatory but clearly skeptical. "I was terrified. He threatened me, implied no one would believe me." Ellie turned to Hank. "But I never stopped painting what I saw, every detail preserved in layers of paint." Hank's composure slipped just slightly. "This is absurd. I mourned Alexis like everyone else. She was a brilliant young artist." "The gallery has backup security systems," Ellie continued, ignoring him. "There are cameras the thieves wouldn't have known about, cameras that would have captured whoever took my painting." This was a bluff, no such backup existed, but Hank couldn't know that. She watched his face carefully, seeing the moment uncertainty crept in. "I'm going to need statements from both of you," Detective Eastwood said. "And Ms. Whitaker, I'll need details about this alleged murder, dates, locations, any potential witnesses." "Of course," she agreed. "I have journals from that time, and the preliminary sketches for blood memory at my studio." Hank moved with unexpected swiftness, grabbing Ellie's arm. "Think about what you're doing," he hissed, low enough that only she could hear. 20 years is a long time. Memories get distorted. You were drinking that night too, remember?" Detective Eastwood stepped forward. "Mr. Whitaker, I'd advise you to let go of Ms. Whitaker immediately." Instead of complying, Hank's grip tightened. "She's lying. There's nothing in that painting but abstract nonsense." "If it's just abstract nonsense, why steal it?" Ellie challenged, pulling away from him. "Why not let everyone see it?" Something dangerous flashed in Hank's eyes. "Because you've built your career on sensationalism. This whole exhibition, it was nothing but a publicity stunt." "We should continue this conversation at the station," Eastwood interjected, moving between them. "Mr. Whitaker, I'd like you to come with me now." "Am I under arrest?" Hank asked, his voice regaining its usual smooth control. "Not at this time, but I have questions that need answers." As Eastwood led Hank out, Ellie remained by the empty frame, heart pounding. She had gambled everything on this moment, and now the painting was gone. Without it, she had no proof beyond her word against that of a celebrated artist. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. With trembling fingers, she opened it. "The original is safe. Check your studio." Confusion gave way to a sudden, impossible hope. L. There was only one person who would sign that way, only one person who might have guessed what Ellie planned, and to do with the exhibition. 20 minutes later, she unlocked her studio door with Detective Eastwood close behind. He'd insisted on accompanying her after she'd shown him the cryptic text. The space appeared undisturbed at first glance. Canvases against walls, brushes in jars, the organized chaos of a working artist. Then she saw it, propped against her. Work table, an identical canvas to the one that had been stolen, the same layers of paint telling the same terrible story. "I don't understand," Eastwood said, looking between Ellie and the painting. "Is this the stolen artwork?" "No," she whispered, moving closer to examine it. "It's a copy, a perfect copy." She turned the canvas over and found a note taped to the back. "I always knew you'd find the courage eventually. When I saw the exhibition announcement, I knew he'd try to silence you again. This is an exact replica. I've been watching you work through studio windows for months, learning your technique. The police won't find fingerprints on the original because I made sure to wear gloves when I took it from your gallery last night. Now you have your evidence, and he doesn't know it exists. Use it well." "You're Lex." Ellie's legs gave way and she sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. Lex, alive. All this time. "Ms. Whitaker." Eastwood crouched beside her, concern evident in his voice. "What does this mean?" She handed him the note with shaking hands. "It means Alexis Wright didn't die that night. Somehow she survived." As Eastwood read the note, his expression shifted from confusion to grim determination. "We need to find her. She's not just a witness now. She's the victim. And the original painting. We'll keep looking, but this," he gestured to the replica, "might be enough to open an investigation, especially if we can locate Ms. Wright." Later that evening, as forensics teams combed through her studio and detectives searched databases for any trace of Alexis Wright, Ellie sat alone in her apartment, staring at her phone. The message she'd composed remained unsent, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. "Where have you been all these years? Why let me believe you were dead?" Before she could press send, another text arrived from the unknown number. "Meet me at the old Lone Cactus gas station. Tomorrow 6 a.m. Come alone." Ellie knew exactly where. The abandoned station where Whitaker once had his studio, where she and Lex had spent countless hours dreaming of their futures as artists, before everything shattered. As night deepened, around her, Ellie felt something shift inside her chest, the weight of 20 years of silence and guilt beginning to lift. Tomorrow, she would face the ghosts of her past. Tomorrow, the real story would begin. The frame wouldn't remain empty any longer.